Hey guys, so after reading your last round of editorials, it's clear that we need to do some reviews about using quotations. We learned about this in sixth grade, but I'm seeing a lot of errors with quotation marks and a lot of things that could be improved with how we're incorporating quotes into our writing. So again, we've covered all this stuff before, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, but I will attach a PDF of this notes page to our daily assignment. So this should be something that you refer back to as needed, especially when you're writing your next editorial. Okay. I want to see those quotes used correctly and used effectively, right? So let's review the basics. When I talk about a quote, I'm talking about something that you're taking word for word from another person, okay? Quotes can never stand alone as their own sentence. I'm seeing you guys do that a lot. And you should always, always have an explanation of who said that quote. I should never have just a quote floating by itself without knowing the context, without knowing who said it, without having it be part of a larger sentence. Okay? So, let's go through where your quotation marks should go and what do you do about capitalization when you're taking pieces of other people's writing. So first of all, you should always use quotation marks before and after a direct quotation. That sounds pretty obvious, but I'm seeing some of you guys start a quote and then never close the quote. Okay? So make sure you've got them in pairs. Quotation marks come in pairs. All right? If a quote is interrupted by other words, place quotation marks around the quoted words only. So if I say something like, "Give me liberty," Patrick Henry cried, or "Give me death," Patrick Henry cried is not part of the quote. It should not be in quotation marks. All right? Another thing I'm seeing you guys mess up a lot is capitalization. So you need to make sure you're capitalizing the first word of the quote when you're quoting a complete sentence. Okay? If you're only using part of a sentence, you don't need to capitalize that. Okay? So we see the examples here. Mr. Johnston was working in his field that morning, said, "The alien spaceship appeared right before my own two eyes." I capitalized the T because that's a complete sentence. Although Mr. Johnson has seen odd happenings on the farm, he stated that the spaceship certainly takes the cake when it comes to unexplainable activity. Certainly takes the cake is just a small fragment of what he said, so I don't need to capitalize. Same as when I'm writing a sentence. I capitalize the start of my sentence. I don't capitalize something random in the middle of my sentence. All right, if you broke up the quote in the middle of the sentence, you don't need to capitalize the second part of the quote. Like I was just saying, we don't capitalize a random word in the middle of our sentence. You don't need to capitalize a random word in the middle of the quote. Okay? All right, so other big issue, punctuation. Okay? Biggest number one thing to remember always, commas and periods that are part of the overall sentence go inside the quotation marks, even if they aren't part of the original quotation. This is probably the number one error I'm seeing. Okay? So this is an example, the best investments today, comma, quotation marks. If you've got a comma, it's going in the quotation marks. Okay? According to Smith, comma, are commodities and emerging market stocks, period, quotation marks. Periods go inside quotation marks. Okay? The only exception to this is when you are citing a book as a source and you are giving me a page number or a parenthetical citation, but you guys aren't doing that right now. So periods should be inside quotation marks. Okay? All right. Unless they are part of the original quotation, all other marks other than commas and periods go outside the quotation marks. So she provides a thorough list of problems in her most recent article, Misery in Paradise, semicolon. She doesn't provide a solution. I don't have my semicolon inside the quotation marks. Wasn't it Dickens who wrote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," quotation mark, question. All right. Since the sentence overall is a question, not the quote itself, the question mark goes outside the quotation marks. Now, if my quote was a question, or my quote was an exclamation, or my quote had a semicolon, then yeah, put those inside the quotation marks. But if it's part of the overall sentence, okay, those go outside. It's just periods and commas that always, always, always go inside the quotation marks. All right, another note about punctuation, if you don't want to use part of the quote, skip over it using an ellipsis, dot, dot, dot. If you just skip a few words, use 3 dots. If you skip a sentence or more, use 4 dots. All right, so you've got an example showing you using the dot, dot, dot as we kind of skip over a few words. All right, so how do I introduce the quote? I told you quotes can never stand alone. You always have to introduce the quote with an explanation of who said it. So how's the best way to do that? All right. One most common way is with a comma. So-and-so says, comma, and then the quote. All right. The flight attendant asked, comma, may I see your boarding pass? So-and-so wrote, comma, and then whatever you're quoting. Okay. So that's the most common one. This person said or wrote this. Here is the quote. Okay, with a comma. Colon. All right, a colon should be used when the text introducing the quote could stand as a sentence on its own. If you're introducing a really long quote, like multiple sentences, we also usually use colons for that. So here's an example. In Food Rules, Michael Pollan summarizes his extensive writing about food with 7 words of advice, colon. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So here, I've given who said the quote, which I have to do. I've explained the context of the quote, and I've done it in a complete sentence. So now I'm just kind of attaching the quote to the end of that complete sentence. So if it's that situation, you want to use a colon, okay? No punctuation. If you're just taking a super short part of a quote, okay, and it flows right in with your writing, so it flows with your existing sentence structure, you don't need to punctuate it, right? So the phrase, be that as it may, appears far too often in the essay. I didn't say, you said, comma, be that as it may, or whatever. It just flows as part of my sentence structure, so I don't need to punctuate the introduction. Just a quick note, if you put the quote first, which is fine to do, you need to change the punctuation at the end of the original quote to a comma, no matter what, okay? So example, Frank died 2 days ago, comma, Charlie writes. All right, so doesn't matter that originally ended with like a period. It's in the first half of my sentence, so I'm going to put a comma because my sentence is continuing, okay? All right, so what else do I need to know? I said using quotes correctly, and I said effectively. All right, so this is the effective part. All right, always make sure your quote adds something to your writing. Okay, I think I might have used this analogy with you guys last year, but think of your essay as a football field. Okay, I'm not a big football fan, but the basic objective is to move the ball down the field. Okay, so if you are building an argument, you want to always be moving your argument down the field, okay? So imagine your quote is like a pass you are sending to a receiver, okay? And you go to pass the ball. If you're passing to someone behind you or right next to you, you're not making a lot of progress, okay? So your quote needs to move things forward. It needs to move the football down the field, okay? So bad example, Zeus had a sudden thought. Chorus 2 tells the reader, Zeus has an idea. Okay? That's just handing the ball to the person next to me. That's not moving anything forward. I just repeated myself. The quote was totally pointless. There's no reason to have a quote there. Okay? Good example. Zeus had a sudden thought, colon, Paris will choose which goddess is the fairest. Now I've moved the ball forward. I've told you what Zeus's thought was. I've added something to the conversation. Okay? Now, if you're using a quote to provide evidence for a claim or statement you made, which hopefully you are doing in your editorials if you're using quotes, you need to sandwich the quote. All right, so you introduce the quote, which you always need to do. You give the quote, and then you explain how the quote supports your argument. Sometimes you guys like to tell me, oh, it's obvious, I don't need to explain it. That's usually not true. Explain it, okay? So, quote sandwich. Here's our example. Eris is a jealous and petty goddess. That's your claim. That's my argument, okay? At the wedding of Thetis and Peleus, she says, so that's my introduction. I've introduced the quote, who says it. I've given context for it, which can be important depending on what we're talking about. May you forever regret insulting me by leaving me off the guest list. Now I've got my quote. She then throws an apple labeled for the fairest into the crowd, leaving the goddesses to fight over it. The ensuing conflict gives Eris the revenge she so desired. So that's my explanation. So I'm showing you why this quote relates to her being jealous and petty, because she's seeking revenge. All right, and finally, always cite your sources. If you do not give me a source for where that quote came from, or if you're just paraphrasing information, meaning putting it in your own words, either way, if you don't cite your sources, you are plagiarizing, okay? All right, so that was a super quick review of, I think, a month of learning about quotes that we did last year. But hopefully this refreshed your memory on some of those rules and we can correctly and effectively use quotes in the future.